The scent of dying white lilies followed Cordelia Bellucci, Morty, into the imperial suite of Palazzo Bellucci, long after the music below had faded into the warm Boston night. The fragrance lingered in the folds of her veil, mingling with the aromas of expensive champagne, candle wax, and fresh roses that filled the enormous suite overlooking the harbor. Only a few hours earlier, more than 300 of the most powerful people in the country had gathered beneath the Palace Hotel's crystal chandeliers to witness the marriage of two legendary dynasties. Politicians, judges, financiers, shipping magnates, and influential members of old East Coast families had stood together to celebrate the union between the Bellucci family and the Morty Empire. To the outside world, it had been the event of the decade. Cordelia had looked radiant in a custom silk gown that flowed around her like liquid ivory. Alessandro Morty had stood beside her in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, handsome enough to make people stare and powerful enough to make them lower their voices when he entered a room. Together they had appeared untouchable. Yet Cordelia had noticed something strange long before the celebration ended. She was not the sort of woman who overlooked details. Years spent restoring centuries-old frescoes had trained her eyes to detect imperfections invisible to everyone else. Tiny fractures hidden beneath layers of paint, hairline cracks spreading silently through stone walls, damage that appeared insignificant until the entire structure collapsed. Throughout the evening, Alessandro's attention had drifted elsewhere. While her father delivered an emotional speech about honor, loyalty, and the strength of family bonds, Alessandro's gaze repeatedly shifted toward the illuminated screen of the phone resting in his lap beneath the tablecloth. Each time Cordelia glanced toward him, he smiled. Each time she smiled back. Each time something inside her whispered that something was wrong. "You've hardly eaten anything," she told him softly as the orchestra played nearby. He leaned closer, pressing a quick kiss against her cheek. "Business never sleeps, tesoro. Even tonight. Especially tonight." His smile was flawless. That was one of Alessandro's many gifts. He knew exactly what people wanted to see. At 34 years old, he had transformed the Morty organization into a legitimate international empire that controlled shipping companies, luxury hotels, investment firms, and real estate developments stretching across 3 continents. Newspapers described him as brilliant. Rivals described him as ruthless. His friends described him as loyal. Cordelia had simply described him as home. By the time the final guests departed, exhaustion had settled into her bones. The enormous imperial suite glowed beneath golden light cast by imported Venetian chandeliers. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering skyline, while thousands of white lilies decorated every corner of the room. Cordelia stood before the mirror and carefully removed the diamond pins from her dark hair. "Would you help me?" she asked softly. "These buttons are impossible to reach." She turned, exposing the delicate line of silk-covered buttons running down the back of her dress. Instead of footsteps approaching, she heard the sharp vibration of a telephone against polished marble. Alessandro glanced down. The color drained from his face. Without a word, he crossed the room and disappeared into the marble bathroom, closing the heavy door behind him. Several minutes passed. Cordelia could hear only fragments of his voice through the thick wood. The tone was urgent, tense, and unusually strained. Finally, the door opened. Alessandro emerged, already reaching for his coat. "Alessandro." He ran a hand through his dark hair. "Matteo has been attacked." The words seemed to suck the warmth from the room. "What?" "He was ambushed on his way home. Someone found him unconscious." Alessandro's expression twisted with apparent anguish. "They're taking him to the hospital." Cordelia's eyes widened. Matteo Rixai was more than Alessandro's closest friend. He was practically family. "Oh my God. I have to go." "Of course you do." She stepped toward him immediately. "I'll come with you." "No." The answer came too quickly. Alessandro immediately softened his expression. "You've been on your feet all day. Stay here and rest. I'll call as soon as I know something. She hesitated. Are you sure? I'm sure. He kissed her forehead. The gesture was affectionate, familiar, and strangely hurried. I love you, Cordelia. Then he was gone. The heavy door closed behind him, with a sound that echoed through the enormous suite. For a long moment, Cordelia remained perfectly still. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows. Inside, silence settled over the room. An hour passed. Then another. She changed into one of the hotel's white robes and sat beside the window, staring down at the city lights while anxiety slowly tightened around her chest. At last, shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, she reached for her phone and typed a message to Matteo's wife. Matteo is all right, isn't he? Alessandro told me what happened. Please tell me if there's anything I can do. 3 minutes later, her phone vibrated. The reply was painfully brief. Cordelia, I don't understand. Matteo is asleep upstairs. We got home hours ago. The world seemed to stop turning. Cordelia read the message once, then twice, then a third time. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she slowly lifted her gaze toward the leather travel bag Alessandro had left beside the bed. The zipper remained partially open. Something silver protruded from the side pocket. His encrypted tablet. In his haste, the careful and disciplined Alessandro Morty had forgotten to take it with him. And for the very first time that night, Cordelia Bellucci Morty understood that the perfect empire surrounding her had begun to crack. Cordelia stared at the silver tablet protruding from Alessandro's leather travel bag while rain streaked the enormous windows of the imperial suite. For several seconds she remained perfectly still, as though the slightest movement might somehow undo the terrible message she had just received. Matteo was safe. Matteo had never been attacked, which meant her husband had lied to her less than 4 hours after promising to love her for the rest of his life. Her hands trembled as she picked up the device. Alessandro guarded his technology obsessively, but years earlier he had given her the access code so she could stream films during long flights. He had never changed it. That realization alone made her stomach twist. Either he believed she trusted him so completely that she would never look, or he believed she was too naive to notice the truth. The screen illuminated the dark room with a pale blue glow. At first she found nothing unusual. There were emails from attorneys, investment reports, security updates, and messages from family associates. Then she noticed a conversation pinned to the top of the screen. The contact name consisted of only 2 words: Valentina Romano. Cordelia immediately recognized the name. Valentina was one of Alessandro's executive assistants, a striking brunette he had introduced during a charity gala nearly 2 years earlier. She remembered the woman's flawless smile, her expensive perfume, and the strange look that had passed between her and Alessandro before disappearing an instant later. Cordelia opened the conversation. The first message made her blood run cold. I can't believe you married her. Alessandro's reply followed seconds later. I had no choice. The council expects stability, and the Bellucci alliance guarantees my position. Another message appeared beneath it. Then prove that you still belong to me. Cordelia's breathing became shallow as she continued reading. The messages stretched backward through months and months of deception. Luxury apartments had been rented, jewelry had been purchased, vacations had been arranged. Alessandro had not simply betrayed her physically. He had built an entirely separate life. Worse still, the affair was not the center of the conspiracy. She soon discovered references to trust funds, inheritance structures, voting rights, and confidential meetings involving the Morty family council. Alessandro had never married her for love. He had married her because the Bellucci family controlled shipping routes, investment networks, and billions of dollars in assets spread across Europe and America. Then she found the final exchange. Valentina had written the message less than an hour earlier. If you aren't here by 2, we're finished. Alessandro's answer came moments later. I'm leaving now. I told her Matteo was attacked. Keep the door unlocked. Cordelia lowered the tablet onto the table beside her. Somewhere beyond the windows, thunder rolled across the city skyline. The woman who had entered the suite as a bride no longer existed. As dawn slowly spread across Boston, she rose from her chair and walked toward the mirror. The reflection staring back at her looked almost identical, but the person behind those dark, unblinking eyes had changed forever. She would not scream. She would not cry. And she would certainly not forgive. Alessandro Morti had declared war on the night of their wedding. He simply didn't know it yet. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the towering windows of the imperial suite as Cordelia Bellucci Morti stood motionless beside the dining table, a porcelain cup of untouched coffee resting between her hands. During the past 4 hours she had read enough messages to destroy an empire. Yet the strange thing was that she no longer felt anger. Anger was hot, unpredictable, and explosive. What had replaced it was something infinitely more dangerous. It was cold. It was patient. It was precise. The sound of a key card sliding into the door lock shattered the silence. Alessandro stepped inside. He looked exactly as she expected him to look. His tie was slightly loosened, the sleeves of his white dress shirt were rolled upward, and carefully arranged exhaustion was painted across his face. To anyone else, he would have appeared to be a loyal friend returning from a long night spent at a hospital bedside. But Cordelia noticed details that nobody else would have seen. A faint trace of expensive perfume lingered on the collar of his coat. His watch had been removed and placed back on the wrong wrist. Even the expression in his eyes seemed rehearsed. "Cordelia," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." She lifted her eyes toward him. "How is Matteo?" Alessandro exhaled heavily as he set his coat over the back of a chair. "He'll recover. The doctors said he was fortunate. Sophia managed to return during the night, so I stayed until she arrived." "Lie." The word echoed silently through her mind. "I imagine you must be exhausted," she said calmly. His shoulders visibly relaxed. "I am." "Then you should shower." A warm smile spread across his face. "You always know exactly what I need." He stepped forward and pressed his lips against her forehead. Once upon a time, the gesture would have filled her heart with affection. Now, she had to force herself not to recoil. It was astonishing how quickly love could transform into revulsion. As Alessandro disappeared into the bathroom, Cordelia heard the sound of running water echoing through the marble chamber. She looked toward the closed door and realized that her life had divided itself into 2 separate parts. There was the woman she had been yesterday, and there was the woman she would become tomorrow. She quietly crossed the suite and picked up Alessandro's tablet. Over the next hour, she read every message she could find. Valentina Romano had not merely shared his bed. She had shared his secrets. Together, they had mocked the Bellucci family, ridiculed the traditions of the Morti organization, and discussed plans that extended far beyond an affair. One message captured Cordelia's attention immediately. "Once the marriage settles, the Bellucci assets become part of the equation." Another message followed. "The council won't question me after that." Cordelia slowly lowered the tablet. Everything suddenly became clear. This had never been about passion. It had never been about temptation. It had been about power. She walked toward the window overlooking the harbor and watched dark clouds gather above the city skyline. Her grandfather had once told her that every great empire eventually collapsed, not because of enemies standing outside its gates, but because of traitors hiding within its walls. For the first time in her life, Cordelia fully understood what he had meant. A lesser woman would have confronted Alessandro immediately. She would have shouted, cried, and demanded answers. But Cordelia Bellucci was the daughter of a family that had survived wars, betrayals, investigations, and generations of enemies. She would not become a victim. She would become a queen. And kings who betrayed their queens rarely kept their crowns for very long. 7 days can pass like a lifetime when someone is living beside the person who destroyed them. For Cordelia Bellucci Morti, every hour became an exercise in discipline. Every smile became part of a performance, and every lie Alessandro spoke became another stone laid carefully into the foundation of his downfall. By the second day after the wedding, they had returned to the magnificent penthouse that overlooked Boston Harbor. Marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, imported artwork covered the walls, and fresh flowers decorated nearly every room. To the outside world, the newly married couple appeared blissfully happy. Alessandro kissed her goodbye each morning before leaving for work, and Cordelia stood at the entrance with a smile on her face as she watched the elevator doors slide closed. Then the war began. She transformed the library into her private command center. The enormous mahogany desk that had once belonged to her grandfather became the headquarters of her operation. Financial records, property documents, trust agreements, security reports, and handwritten notes slowly accumulated across its polished surface. While Alessandro spent his afternoons dividing his attention between the Morty organization and Valentina Romano, Cordelia quietly assembled every piece of the puzzle. The deeper she looked, the uglier the truth became. The affair itself was merely the surface of something far more sinister. Alessandro had been laying the foundation for years. Shell companies had been created under false names. Secret investments had been established overseas. Luxury properties had been purchased through intermediary corporations. Millions of dollars had moved silently between accounts, hidden beneath layers of complicated transactions. Then she found something that caused her pulse to quicken. 3 months earlier, Alessandro had initiated discussions regarding the future structure of the Bellucci Legacy Trust. The proposal included clauses that would gradually transfer partial administrative control into Morty-controlled entities following the completion of the marriage. Cordelia stared at the documents in disbelief. He had planned everything. Even before he placed the ring on her finger, Alessandro had already been calculating how much of her inheritance he could eventually control. That evening, he returned home carrying a bouquet of white roses. "For my beautiful wife," he said, smiling warmly. Cordelia accepted the flowers. "You're spoiling me." "Never." He wrapped his arms around her waist while she fought the urge to pull away. "You've been quiet lately." She looked into his eyes. "I've simply been thinking about the future." A strange expression flickered across his face before disappearing completely. "That's exactly what I've been doing." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. It was almost amusing. Both of them were planning the future, yet each envisioned an entirely different ending. Late that night, long after Alessandro had fallen asleep, Cordelia quietly slipped from the bed and entered his private office. Moonlight spilled across the floor as she opened his computer and inserted an encrypted storage device into one of the ports. Files began copying immediately. Bank records, property deeds, surveillance logs, messages, transaction histories. Every secret Alessandro possessed gradually became hers. As she worked, another message appeared on his synchronized tablet. Valentina had written only 3 words. "When will you choose?" Alessandro's answer arrived moments later. "Soon, I promise." Cordelia read the exchange twice before calmly placing the tablet back onto the desk. Then she removed her wedding ring. The diamond caught the moonlight as she held it in the palm of her hand. Just 1 week earlier, she had believed it represented loyalty, devotion, and trust. Now it looked remarkably similar to a pair of handcuffs. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark sky. Inside, the queen continued preparing for war. Alessandro still believed he was living with a loving wife. He had absolutely no idea that he was sharing his home with the architect of his own destruction. The 7th morning of Cordelia Bellucci Morty's marriage arrived beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Heavy clouds drifted across the horizon, casting long shadows through the penthouse windows as a steady wind rattled the glass overlooking Boston Harbor. The city itself seemed to be holding its breath. Cordelia stood quietly in the kitchen, her fingers wrapped around a porcelain cup filled with black tea, while Alessandro adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal gray suit in the reflection of the hallway mirror. To anyone watching them, they would have looked like a perfectly ordinary couple beginning another day together. Only Cordelia knew that by sunset, one of them would cease to exist within the other's world forever. Alessandro glanced toward her and smiled. It was the same smile that had captivated politicians, investors, journalists, and rivals for years. It was warm, confident, and carefully practiced. "I hate leaving you alone on a Sunday," he said. "The council meeting shouldn't take more than a few hours." Cordelia almost admired the elegance of the lie. The synchronized messages on his tablet had revealed the truth the night before. Valentina had arranged an entire weekend retreat in the Berkshire Mountains. A private villa had been reserved, champagne had already been delivered, and Alessandro had promised that the woman he had abandoned on their wedding night would soon be nothing more than an unpleasant memory. Cordelia lowered her cup. "Don't worry about me. I'll be home before dinner." "I'm sure you will." He stepped forward and kissed her cheek. "Love you." For the first time in 7 days, Cordelia said nothing. A slight crease appeared between Alessandro's eyebrows, before disappearing almost instantly. Then he picked up his coat, walked through the front door, and disappeared. 10 seconds later, the elevator doors closed. Cordelia looked at the clock hanging on the wall. 9 o'clock. The final phase had begun. The warmth vanished from her expression as she walked into the master bedroom. Beneath the bed rested a medium-sized black travel bag she had secretly packed during the previous week. Inside were only the essentials: cash, identification documents, several changes of clothing, a burner phone, family records, and the encrypted storage device containing every secret Alessandro had tried so desperately to conceal. She left everything else behind. The expensive jewelry remained in its velvet cases. The designer dresses stayed inside the closet. The luxurious gifts Alessandro had purchased over the years were arranged exactly where they had always been. Cordelia wanted nothing that belonged to him. She crossed the room and approached the mirrored vanity. The diamond bracelet Alessandro had presented to her during their wedding reception lay beside a crystal perfume bottle. One by one, she removed every symbol of the life she was leaving behind. Last came the engagement ring. The enormous emerald-cut diamond sparkled brilliantly beneath the morning light. She slowly slid it from her finger. Its absence felt surprisingly liberating. Then Cordelia entered Alessandro's private office. The computer awakened immediately as she touched the keyboard. Within minutes, encrypted files began uploading to multiple destinations. Members of the Morty family council would receive them the following morning. Attorneys would receive copies. Auditors would receive evidence. Investigators would receive financial records. Alessandro's entire world was quietly approaching the edge of a cliff. Finally, Cordelia returned to the kitchen island. She placed Alessandro's tablet directly in the center of the marble surface and opened a photograph hidden deep within a protected folder. The image showed Alessandro and Valentina standing together inside the imperial suite on the night of the wedding. In the background, Cordelia's veil rested silently upon a chair. Beneath the tablet, she placed a bank statement showing the nearly empty balance of their joint account. Across the paper, she wrote 3 words in red ink. "I know, goodbye." At precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon, Cordelia Bellucci Morty picked up her bag, opened the door, and walked away from the empire she had once believed would become her home. She never looked back. The rain had not stopped by the time Alessandro Morty returned to Boston. Water streamed across the windows of the luxury sedan as the city lights shimmered through the darkness like fragments of broken glass. He leaned comfortably against the leather seat, feeling the familiar satisfaction of a man who believed he controlled every aspect of his life. The weekend in the Berkshire Mountains had unfolded exactly as he had intended. Valentina had finally stopped complaining. The council remained unaware of his deception, and Cordelia was still waiting at home, blissfully ignorant of the truth. Valentina turned toward him as the car slowed before the entrance to the penthouse building. The diamonds around her neck sparkled beneath the passing lights. "You'll call me tomorrow?" she asked. Alessandro smiled. "You know I will. You've been saying that for 2 years. And I've kept you close for 2 years." She laughed softly. "One day you'll have to choose." I already have. The lie emerged effortlessly. He stepped from the car and buttoned his coat against the cold wind. For a moment he stood motionless beneath the towering entrance, admiring his reflection in the glass doors. Powerful, wealthy, untouchable. That was how the world saw Alessandro Morti. That illusion lasted less than 5 minutes. The moment he stepped inside the penthouse, something felt wrong. Silence. The enormous residence was always quiet, but this was different. The air itself seemed heavier. The lamps remained dark. The fireplace was cold. Even the scent of Cordelia's favorite lilies had disappeared. Cordelia. No answer came. He loosened his tie and walked into the kitchen. Then he stopped moving. His tablet rested in the center of the marble island, exactly where he had left neither it nor anything else before. Beside it lay a folded sheet of paper. Resting on top of the paper were 2 glittering objects. Cordelia's wedding ring. Cordelia's engagement ring. A sudden chill spread through his body. No. He crossed the room so quickly that one of the chairs toppled behind him. His fingers closed around the paper as his heart hammered violently against his ribs. The first thing he saw was the bank statement. The second thing he saw was the account balance. The third thing he saw was the message written across the page in crimson ink. I know, goodbye. For several seconds he simply stared. Then he reached for the tablet. The screen illuminated instantly. A photograph filled the display. Alessandro felt the blood drain from his face. He recognized the image immediately. It was a photograph Valentina had taken inside the imperial suite on the night of the wedding. He stood beside her, smiling as though he had not abandoned his bride only minutes earlier. In the background, Cordelia's veil rested across a chair like a ghost, silently witnessing the destruction of an entire future. The tablet slipped from his fingers and struck the floor. No. He sprinted toward the master bedroom. The closet doors flew open. Everything expensive remained behind. The dresses, the shoes, the jewelry, but all the truly valuable things were gone. Her passport, her personal journals, her family documents, her grandmother's necklace, her favorite books. The woman he thought he knew had vanished. Panic exploded inside him. He grabbed his phone and dialed Cordelia's number. The call failed immediately. He called again. Nothing. A third attempt produced the same result. At that exact moment, another realization struck him with devastating force. Cordelia had known. Not for an hour. Not for a day. For an entire week. She had smiled at him. She had kissed him. She had listened to every lie that came from his mouth. All the while she had been carefully, patiently, and mercilessly destroying him. For the first time in many years, Alessandro Morti understood what fear truly felt like. And somewhere beyond the storm, the queen who had built his empire was already disappearing into the darkness. Alessandro Morti did not sleep that night. He spent hour after hour pacing across the marble floors of the empty penthouse while rain lashed against the towering windows overlooking the harbor. Every room carried traces of Cordelia's presence, yet the woman herself had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. The silence surrounding him was unbearable. It settled over the furniture, drifted through the hallways, and wrapped itself around him like a tightening noose. By dawn, he had convinced himself that he could still regain control of the situation. Cordelia was intelligent, but she was emotional. Eventually, she would answer his calls. Eventually, she would remember their years together. Eventually, she would return. Then his phone rang. The name flashing across the screen belonged to Lorenzo Castellano. Alessandro immediately straightened. Lorenzo was not only one of the most powerful members of the Morti family council, but also the man responsible for overseeing the organization's internal affairs. He never called without a reason. Lorenzo, get to headquarters immediately. Alessandro frowned. What's happened? Everything. The line went dead. Less than 40 minutes later, Alessandro stepped out of his car in front of Morty Tower. The enormous structure of glass, marble, and steel rose into the gray morning sky like a monument to the empire his family had built over generations. Yet something was different. Security officers stood at every entrance. Dark vehicles lined the street. Men and women dressed in expensive suits moved through the lobby with grim expressions. The moment Alessandro entered the executive floor, every conversation stopped. Lorenzo stood at the far end of the conference room beside an enormous mahogany table. Silver-haired and impeccably dressed, he looked less like a businessman and more like a king preparing to pronounce a sentence. "Sit down," he said quietly. Alessandro remained standing. "What is this?" Lorenzo slid a thick black folder across the table. "You tell me." Alessandro opened it. The first page contained copies of the messages exchanged between him and Valentina. The second page contained financial records connected to the luxury apartment he had secretly purchased. The third page revealed photographs, bank transfers, surveillance logs, and encrypted communications. Page after page exposed every hidden detail of his carefully constructed deception. His pulse quickened. "Where did you get this?" Lorenzo stared at him. "Your wife." Alessandro felt his mouth go dry. The older man slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the table. "Do you understand what you've done? It isn't what it looks like." Lorenzo's eyes darkened. "You abandoned your bride on your wedding night. You lied to the Bellucci family. You placed the stability of this organization at risk. You concealed financial transactions from the council and involved an employee in an inappropriate relationship." Alessandro swallowed hard. "I can explain." "Can you explain this?" Lorenzo placed another document before him. Alessandro looked down. The color drained from his face. It was a detailed report outlining plans to transfer administrative authority over portions of the Bellucci Legacy Trust into entities connected to the Morty organization. "That's impossible," he whispered. Apparently, Cordelia discovered everything. Another door opened behind him. Valentina entered the conference room. She looked terrified. Two security officers followed closely behind her. The sight alone told Alessandro that the situation was far worse than he had imagined. Lorenzo folded his hands calmly. "Miss Romano has already confessed her involvement." Alessandro turned toward her. "You told them." Valentina laughed bitterly. "You think I was going to sacrifice myself for you?" Something inside him shattered. At that moment, he finally understood the terrible truth. Cordelia had never intended to fight him. She had intended to judge him. And now the Queen had delivered her verdict. 3 days after his appearance before the Morty family council, Alessandro Morty found himself sitting alone inside a dimly lit office overlooking the Charles River. The man who had once commanded fleets of cargo ships, controlled investment groups worth billions of dollars, and moved effortlessly through circles of power now looked like a stranger occupying the ruins of another person's life. His expensive suit hung loosely from his shoulders, dark circles had formed beneath his eyes, and the unwavering confidence that had defined him for years had begun to disappear. Cordelia Bellucci, Morty, had become a ghost. Every trace of her existence had vanished. Her telephone number no longer existed. Her bank accounts had been closed. Her social media profiles had disappeared. Even the private airfields, ports, and transportation companies connected to the Bellucci family had yielded nothing. For the first time in his life, Alessandro was facing an opponent he could neither intimidate nor predict. Victor Morrow arrived precisely at noon. The investigator carried a thick leather folder beneath his arm and wore the expression of a man burdened by unpleasant truths. For more than 20 years, he had tracked fugitives, located hidden assets, and uncovered secrets that powerful people would have killed to protect. Alessandro had expected answers. Instead, Victor simply sat down. "Did you find her?" Alessandro demanded. Victor remained silent for several seconds. No. Alessandro stared at him. What do you mean, no? I mean exactly that. Everyone leaves a trail. Apparently, Cordelia Bellucci doesn't. Alessandro leaned forward. That's impossible. Victor slowly opened the folder lying before him. Your wife liquidated several personal holdings before she disappeared. She transferred assets into legally protected trusts, terminated accounts connected to her married name, and rerouted financial activity through intermediaries beyond the reach of ordinary investigators. Keep looking. I did. Look harder. Victor sighed heavily. She anticipated every move. He slid several photographs across the desk. The first showed the rear service entrance of the penthouse building. The second revealed a black sedan waiting in the rain. The third captured Cordelia herself. She wore dark glasses and an elegant trench coat. Her expression was calm, composed, and entirely unreadable. Alessandro reached toward the photograph. The image had been taken only moments before she vanished forever. Where did the vehicle go? He asked. Nowhere that I could prove. You lost her. No. Victor's expression darkened. She allowed herself to disappear. Alessandro rose abruptly from his chair and crossed the room. Rage, frustration, humiliation, and desperation collided inside him with terrifying force. Find her. Victor looked directly into his eyes. You still don't understand, do you? Alessandro turned toward him. Understand what? This isn't a woman running away from her husband. Victor tapped the photograph resting on the desk. This is a queen abandoning her kingdom because its king betrayed her. Alessandro laughed bitterly. She's an art historian. No. Victor slowly closed the folder. She's the granddaughter of Giovanni Bellucci. The room suddenly fell silent. Giovanni Bellucci had built one of the most powerful family networks in the world. His influence extended through governments, financial institutions, shipping routes, and private security organizations across multiple continents. Victor continued speaking. Your grandfather built an empire through force. Hers built one through patience. Those are entirely different kinds of power. Alessandro's jaw tightened. I want results. You want honesty. Victor stood. Then here it is. You spent years believing Cordelia was merely standing beside the throne. In reality, she was the throne. Outside the window, dark clouds gathered over the city. Somewhere beyond the ocean, the woman he had betrayed was beginning an entirely new life. And Alessandro had absolutely no idea where to find her. 8 months later, the golden light of autumn drifted across the rooftops of Florence, painting the ancient city in shades of amber and bronze. The cool morning air carried the scents of roasted coffee, old stone, and distant rain as Cordelia Bellucci stood upon a wooden scaffold inside the Basilica of Santa Croce. Fine particles of dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, while she carefully guided a delicate brush across a Renaissance fresco that had not been fully restored in more than 2 centuries. The woman standing beneath the painted ceiling no longer resembled the bride who had once walked through the grand halls of Palazzo Bellucci. The elaborate gowns, glittering jewels, and carefully rehearsed smiles had all disappeared. In their place stood a woman wearing simple clothes, her dark hair loosely tied behind her shoulders, her expression calm and untroubled. For the first time in many years, Cordelia felt completely free. She had reclaimed her birth name 3 months earlier, shortly after the annulment had been finalized. The Bellucci Legacy Trust had quietly resumed operating under her direct authority, and every remaining connection to Alessandro Morti had been permanently severed. Thousands of miles away, his world continued collapsing while hers expanded into something infinitely more beautiful. Her small apartment overlooked the Arno River, and every morning she woke to the sound of church bells echoing across the city. She spent her afternoons restoring priceless works of art and her evenings wandering through narrow streets illuminated by warm golden lanterns. The silence she had once feared had become her greatest source of peace. As Cordelia carefully lowered her brush, Her phone vibrated softly inside the pocket of her coat. The message came from Marco De Luca. She smiled faintly. Marco had served as her grandfather's personal attorney for almost 30 years and remained one of the very few people who knew precisely where she was. She opened the message. Everything has been finalized. Cordelia slowly descended from the scaffold and stepped into the center of the vast basilica. Marble columns rose toward the distant ceiling, while ancient shadows drifted across the walls. Another message appeared. Alessandro has officially been removed from all positions of authority within the organization. Cordelia read the words quietly. Then another message arrived. Valentina Romano disappeared shortly after the investigation began. No one has seen her since. The third message took slightly longer to appear. The council discovered additional irregularities involving concealed assets and fraudulent transactions. Several investigations remain active. Cordelia slipped the phone back into her pocket. Months earlier, she might have felt satisfaction upon hearing such news. She might even have celebrated. Instead, she simply felt a strange and profound stillness settle over her. Hatred required energy. Anger demanded attention. And Alessandro no longer deserved either. A gentle breeze drifted through the enormous windows of the basilica as Cordelia stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight. Tourists wandered through the nearby streets, while musicians played violins beneath ancient stone archways. Her thoughts drifted back to the woman she had once been. She remembered the wedding dress, the white lilies, the lies, the silence. Then she remembered the woman she had become. Strong, patient, unbreakable. Her grandfather had once told her that people revealed their true nature when they believed there would be no consequences for their actions. Alessandro had believed himself untouchable. He had mistaken kindness for weakness and loyalty for submission. He had been disastrously wrong. Cordelia looked up toward the clear blue sky and smiled softly. Far across the ocean, a king was still mourning the loss of his kingdom. Meanwhile, the queen he had betrayed had finally found something infinitely more valuable than revenge. She had found herself. 1 year after Cordelia Bellucci Morty disappeared from Boston, the city was buried beneath the silver light of winter. Snow drifted across the streets surrounding Morty Tower while thousands of lights glittered against the dark sky. Inside the building, however, the atmosphere was cold and lifeless. The empire that Alessandro Morty had once ruled with absolute confidence no longer belonged to him. The investigations had continued for months. Bank accounts had been frozen. Executives had resigned. Private communications had been exposed. Business partnerships had collapsed. The family council had stripped Alessandro of his authority, removed his access to the Bellucci Legacy Trust, and permanently erased him from every succession plan that had once guaranteed his future. The most painful wound, however, had not been financial. It had been personal. Cordelia had never returned. Alessandro stood alone inside his office as snowflakes drifted past the enormous windows. The room was almost empty now. The paintings had been removed. The expensive furniture had been sold. Even the great bronze Morty emblem had disappeared from the wall behind his desk. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Lorenzo Castellano stepped inside. The older man studied Alessandro for a long moment. "You received a package this morning." Alessandro looked up immediately. "From whom?" There was no name attached to it. Lorenzo placed a small black box upon the desk before turning toward the door. "Whatever happens next, remember that you chose it." The door closed softly behind him. Alessandro stared at the box for several seconds before slowly lifting the lid. Inside, he discovered 3 objects. The first was the silver key to the imperial suite, where he had abandoned his bride on their wedding night. The second was the diamond engagement ring Cordelia had left behind. The third was a sealed envelope. His hands trembled as he opened it. A single sheet of paper rested inside. The handwriting was unmistakable. Alessandro, by the time you read this letter, an entire year will have passed since the night I walked away from the life we built together. You once asked me why I loved restoring damaged works of art. The answer was always simple. Broken things tell the truth. Cracked marble reveals hidden foundations. Faded paint exposes forgotten histories. And shattered hearts reveal the true nature of the people who break them. You believed that wealth created power. You believed that influence created loyalty. You believed that silence meant weakness. You were wrong. I did not leave because I hated you. I left because I finally understood my own worth. You searched for me because you thought I belonged to you. I never did. The greatest punishment I could have given you was not revenge. It was absence. I hope one day you learn the difference between possession and love. Goodbye, Alessandro. Cordelia. The letter slipped from his fingers. At that moment, he understood that the woman he had lost would never return. Thousands of miles away, the bells of Florence echoed through the evening air as Cordelia stood on the balcony of her home overlooking the Arno River. Golden lights reflected across the water while laughter drifted upward from the streets below. The world around her was alive with possibility. Her phone vibrated gently. Another restoration project had been approved. Another chapter of her life had begun. She looked toward the endless horizon and smiled. The frightened bride who had sat alone in the imperial suite had disappeared forever. In her place stood the true heir of the Bellucci legacy. The queen had not destroyed the kingdom. She had simply chosen to build a better one. And somewhere far behind her, a man who had once possessed everything finally understood that the most valuable things in life could never be owned. They could only be cherished before they were gone. The scent of lilies still lingered in his memory. But Cordelia Bellucci was already beyond his reach. Forever,